Imagine a wall that has stood for generations, stone upon stone, names and histories carved into its shadow. Imagine that wall beginning to tremble, not with the push of an enemy, but with the slow, undeniable proof that something had been built on a lie. What was hidden beneath those foundations? What secret could make the gates of the greatest city bend like grass before the wind? The answer, when it comes, is not a single crime, but a pattern. Small betrayals piled until they become a city's ruin. This is Nahum's message, consolation for the faithful, a warning for the proud, and the uncovering of dark things a people thought forever sealed. He was called Nahum of Elkosh. His name, spoken in the markets and in quiet rooms, meant consolation. But the voice that woke him before dawn was not gentle. It pressed like a river into him, and when it spoke it made the stones in his chest vibrate with urgency. I have to tell you what he remembered. The first time the voice came, it was like a memory insisting on being lived. He saw a city like a lion, sleeping with the spoils of many nights curled at its paws. He saw the river that ran red in some visions, not for spectacle, but as a symbol of what lies accumulate in the deep places when people turn their eyes from justice. Nahum's life before the call was small, known to a few, a village of low, sun-baked houses, a mother who mended robes and taught him to read letters that looked like a map of the skies. He learned the holy texts the way a child learns a mother's face, by repetition, by touch. But prophecy arrived not as a classroom lesson, it arrived as a rupture. In the middle of sleep, he would sit up and feel the furnace of resolve beneath his ribs. What begins to move in a man called is often not an appetite to be seen, but a compulsion that seizes the throat and will not let him be quiet. "Comfort is not my only task," Nahum said once, alone beside the pool near Elkosh, its water like a mirror for the mountains. "I must speak what I hear. I must name what the city will not name for itself." He did not choose the road to Nineveh because he loved spectacle. He went because the voice continued. There was no triumph in his leaving, no chariot of heralds, no public farewell. When he set out, the village watched him go like a family watches the oldest son walk into a storm. They knew the prophecies could be sweet or bitter. They had seen prophets bring harvests of hope and harvests of sorrow. Nahum took with him only a worn cloak, a small satchel, and the tremor of expectation that follows a man who believes he carries words not entirely his own. Arrival in Nineveh was like stepping into a different weather. Elkosh had been honest air. Nineveh had perfume and flags that never sagged. Palatial banners blew above broad streets, filled with traders and soldiers. The city was a machine for making noise and pleasure. The river hummed with commerce, the docks full of quiet hands that moved like a second heartbeat beneath the show. Priests walked with the confidence of men whose altars paid their bills. Temples shone with brazen things, and the public squares were full of laughter that did not always reach the eyes. Nahum's first days were not dramatic. He did not burst into the royal court unannounced. He walked the market, breathed the incense, watched children sell pottery with faces too old for their years. He listened. "There is a way," he would say later, "that a city tells you its true nature. It is in what is hidden from the procession. It is in the corners where the light moves differently and where the stones seem to remember things the people would rather forget." On the second morning he spoke. A small crowd gathered, more out of curiosity than conviction. They had heard of prophets, men who call down rain or curse a harvest, but Nahum's voice did something stranger. It asked questions about foundations. He stood in a square shaded by date palms and said bluntly, "A wall can hide what a heart will not. A city that devours the cry of the poor will be devoured by what it hides." His words were not flowery. They were short and sharp, like the slap of a palm onto a table. The laughter thinned. Some turned away. Others leaned in, as if to test whether the man meant to mock or to endanger. The high places of the city reacted the way those in power always react when a light falls upon their ledger, with annoyance first, then calculation. The priests alone softened, not from repentance, but from assessing risk. They had their own interests. The king, already rumored to be proud, his garments heavy with signet and ornament, heard of Nahum more as an irritation than a threat. A man in tattered robes did not fit the city's noise. Watching from an upper balcony that peered into the square was Malik. He was young, though not as young as boys who still ran between the stalls, and his hands were skilled in ink and roll. A scribe by training and a watcher by assignment, Malik had been placed there by the palace to keep an eye on any who would make public claims. The prince of the palace had said, "Record everything. Let no rumor pass unmarked." Malik's job, in theory, was simple: to transcribe, to inventory, to preserve the image of the city as a thing orderly and controlled. But eyes watch and hearts decide. Listening to Nahum made an unusual sound in Malik's chest. He had learned to keep to the edges of power, the way a reed bends with the current and avoids the sharpness of stones. There is security in not being memorable, he thought most mornings. Yet this voice, this man who spoke of foundations and small deaths, made his ink feel suddenly like a weapon. If words could wound a city, as Nahum claimed, then words might also open sealed doors. Malik followed Nahum after that first speech, not out of heroism, but from curiosity that soon turned to disquiet. He would shadow him into crowds, watch him stop at wells, and listen as people muttered names into the dust. Sometimes Nahum would place a hand on someone's shoulder with the gentleness of a man who knew sorrow. "Remember," he would say once to an old woman whose hands trembled, "the ground remembers what the mouth denies." The woman answered with a shake of her head and a look that could have been warning or plea. The court was not slow to respond. A messenger came to the square, brassed and polite. The city needed order, the messenger announced, and he invited Nahum to speak within the royal compound. There was a theatre to control the theatre of speech. Some in the crowd shouted, "Let him speak." Others hissed, worried that a prophet's words could rouse more than conscience. Nahum accepted. He went because the voice drove him, and because prophets stand where the voices meet power. That is where truth is either swallowed or set free. Before he reached the gate, Nahum paused. He looked back at the crowd he had left. A shifting tide of faces, commerce, a few children still scraping mud houses with hopes measured in pottery. He closed his eyes for a moment and breathed, as if steeling himself against an unseen current. "I do not come to enthrall with riddles," he said to no one and everyone, "but to speak plainly. There is a ledger that must be read." The phrase hung between the trees like a promise. If you imagine power in Nineveh as a single column, you would be mistaken. It was a mesh, palace, temple, marketplace, each thread held together by practices the people no longer remembered they had adopted. Some of those practices had a name, patronage. Some had a softer name, ritual, but in the small rooms where agreements were signed and vows exchanged, there lay the true architecture of influence. Money could buy silence, temples could sanctify transactions, the voice of a few could drown the cry of many. Nahum had come to show that those private mechanisms, repeated enough, become public injustice. Malik's position between the palace and the public grew uneasy. His fingers, used to the precise curl of script, began to tremble when he transcribed Nahum's words. Each time Nahum used a phrase, "The foundations are full of blood," he said once. Malik felt ink thicken on his reed. He started to look not at the spectacle of the prophet, but at the people in the background. A priest clutching an amulet, a soldier with a burnished shield and alert eyes, a merchant whose cloak concealed the glint of a signet ring. What did those rings mean? What were they signing in the shadows? The city has a way of making complicity ordinary. A man pays a tax to a captain, And that captain, in turn, ensures that the merchant's debts are overlooked. The priest blesses a contract, and the scribe, trained to be neutral, records the transaction with a hand that does not tremble. Over time, these small accommodations grow teeth. They bite those whose voices are the weakest. Nahum named this slowly, so that it would land like a stone. There is no safe ledger when the poor are priced out of justice. It was a blunt sentence, but one that landed on wealth like a shadow. This is where the first fracture in Malik began. He was trained to preserve the city's memory, the good lists, the names of honored donors, the allocations. But records are not neutral if they hide the truth that the city preferred to collect. He had always believed that ink bears witness. Now he wondered which witnesses were allowed to speak. He carried secrets he had transcribed, lists of donations, of temple expenditures, of construction contracts. What if beneath those contracts were other lists, names of those who had been promised but never delivered justice? What if the ledger had margins filled with tiny pencil marks that read like a plea? One rainy evening settled over the city. Rare enough to make the market slow, Malik followed a lead. He had seen, tucked behind a row of other rolls in the archive, the outline of a seal that did not match any of the usual palatial stamps. It was smaller, worn, as if the roll had been read many times and then hidden away. His official duty would have been to close the shelf and report the anomaly to his supervisor. But his hand did something the training had not programmed. It reached for the roll. Inside the dim archive, where dust lay like the hush of old days, Malik unrolled the parchment by the light of a single oil lamp. The script at first looked ordinary, lists, places, numbers, but as he read he felt the air tighten. Names, not numbers, but names of people who had been accepted into the foundations. The phrase was innocuous in other contexts. Stones do need bedrock, but here it carried a tone that made the breath stop in his throat. Beside some names were marks, a loop, a signet impression, a small notation that read, in the margin, vow fulfilled. There were dates, there were signatures. The ink had a kind of impatience to it, as if the scribe had been nervous. He did not read aloud. He would speak of it many times later, but in that moment he simply closed the roll and felt a winter drop into his stomach. The city was full of ritual language that masked acts. The word foundation could be literal, or it could be a polite myth for the tomb of a promise. Malik had seen bracelets, small filigree things, tucked into corners of the temple storerooms, tokens of vows, but nothing matched the cold clarity of a list with names, signed and sealed. Whoever had written these records had believed there would be no discovery. Whoever had authorized the seals had believed in silence. He did what scribes do. He made a copy. Not an exact copy. He did not have time or safety, but enough to hold the pattern of the list in his head. Then he replaced the roll, even more carefully than he had taken it, as if the archive itself would punish rash fingers. He left the storeroom with sweat cooling on his neck and a question folding him inward. If this could be proven, what would it mean for the city? For the king? For those who had taken vows, and for those whose names were written like margins in a script of shame? Malik did not keep his discovery to himself for long. Fear may lock mouths, but truth finds places to speak. He sought out Harith, the elder scribe whose back bent not simply from years, but from the weight of memory. Harith had refined hands. He had seen more ledgers than any in the palace, and his eyes had the steady calm of a man who had watched empires rise and fall like the pattern of seasons. "You carry something heavy," Harith said when Malik arrived at his modest home, its windows covered by strips of linen to keep the light gentle. He held a cup of bitter tea and watched Malik as if reading a script. "Scribes carry more than ink. We bear the names of those who cannot speak for themselves." "These are not only names," Malik answered, and the words cut the air. "They are instructions. There are signatures and seals. Some of the marks are palatial. Some bear the temple's stamp. Harith's face did not change at first. He had seen seals peel like varnish before, but his hands closed over the cup until his knuckles whitened. If what you say is true, then the city has been using its religion to sanctify something else. The altar becomes a cover. Why would they... Malik floundered. Why would they write names and then... Because silence is easier than sorrow, Harith finished for him. Because when you name a child in a ledger and then bury that name under stone, you remove the child's right to be mourned. You turn a person into property, a promise into construction material. Do you not see? The ledger becomes a contract for forgetting. They found Naum in the place the city kept objects that were too small for the temple, but too large for the street. A small house on the edge of the quarters where memory could be stored without fuss. Naum's hair was a crown of white. Her hands held the steady work of someone used to mending what others considered useless. Her face had grooves like a worn coin. When she smiled, a faint light still found a way through. Naum had been the keeper of things. Broken bracelets, a child's pendant, a small clay token with a name scratched and half erased. She kept boxes that smelled of cedar and salt. Her work was not glamorous. She did not keep records of kings or of the great. She kept what people could not afford to forget, but were often forced to leave behind. "You do not have to tell me," she said when Malik and Harith entered, as if she already knew the shape of their question. "Names have a way of arriving at my doorstep. They come in the mouths of widows, in the moss beneath a threshold. I stitch them into cloth. I weave them into things that can last." Her hands moved over a small bracelet, rubbing dust from its threads like someone restoring a breath to a sleeping child. "People bring me their small losses because I promise to keep them as if they were my own." She did not say, "This cannot be." She simply set down the bracelet and said, matter-of-factly, "Some of the names you found in those scrolls were brought to me wrapped in rags. They were not always said as losses. Sometimes a man would drop a token here and tell me it was an offering. He asked me to keep it until the coin came back. Do you understand the language of bargaining? It is not always loud. It is cheap, and it speaks in small ways." Harith listened with the look of a man cataloguing evidence in his mind. Malik, younger and less practiced, felt the air constrict around him. "If these tokens were offerings," Harith said finally, "we might be talking about vows that were kept with payment. But if the lists are named to construction, then we must ask, who ordered those foundations? And why would they need names as proof?" Naum pointed to a box beneath the table and lifted its lid with reverence. Inside lay small things, a clay toy, a chipped cup, a ring, dark with age. On top rested a thin ribbon braided with thread and a small charm in the shape of a bird. "This was given to a child by its mother," she said. "The mother told me she had promised it as a vow. She thought it would keep her child safe if they placed the charm in the city's foundation. She thought naming would bind a god to keep them warm. People tried many things to protect those they could not control." The three of them sat like that for a long time, the lamp between them making small moons on the table. They were not a council of the powerful. They were a knot of witnesses, a young scribe with an accident of courage, an old keeper of ledgers who had learned to read the silence between words, and a woman whose hands could hold 1,000 small stories. They could not, at that table, pretend to be anything more than a nascent court of conscience. "Tell me," Malik said at last, voice small, "if we took these lists to the king, if we unrolled them in the palace, would it shame him? Could he act? Would we have justice?" Harith's reply was not blunt, but it was clear. Power has its own grammar. It can be made to bend, but only if one is ready for the fracture. The king will weigh the ledger of his honor against the ledger of his safety. He will ask, lust of empire always asks, what will be lost if truth is made public. "Then what do we do?" Malik asked, almost afraid to know the sound of his own question. Naum lifted a small token and passed it to Malik. "You must look at the names," she said. "You must learn them as if they were your kin. Whoever preserves them will have an obligation. Memory is not neutral. Keeping a name alive is a dangerous mercy." It was a mercy that demanded action. They began to plan, not with any illusion of triumph, but with the cautiousness of those who know the cost of speaking. Harith suggested copies, careful transcriptions that could be verified. Noema spoke of artifacts that could prove presence, bracelets, tokens with matching marks. Malik listened and felt the knot in his chest tighten and loosen like a hand that refused to let go of something dear. He had been a recorder of what was said. Now he was learning to be a keeper of what was hidden. In the days that followed, Nahum's speech sharpened. Wherever he stood, he cut into the city's self-congratulation by naming the mechanics of its arrogance. "The gods you make to bless you," he said once, "are the very hands that keep you from grieving." The words were blunt, and the city reacted as cities do, with petitions of safety, then with quiet threats. The priests fretted, the merchants recalculated, and the king sent observers whose eyes were like knives. The rumor of the rolls, however, began to weave itself into the city like a thin thread. It moved mostly at night, a whisper at taverns, a direction given under breath. People who had little to gain from silence whispered to those who had everything to lose. Malik found that carrying ink had evolved into carrying a conscience that would not be soothed by the pace of daily business. He kept waking at night, haunted by the lines he had read and the names he had almost memorized. Nahum, for his part, did not flee. He stood in the market and in the temples and told the people plainly that judgment begins where the city believes itself safe. "Who will answer for the little ones whose names vanish?" he demanded. "Where do the vows live if not kept? What makes an altar holy if it is fed with the quiet of the poor?" Some days, as if to test the moral weather, the high priests invited Nahum to speak before them in the outer courts of the temple. It was a space where the public and sacred met, where words could be performed with the backing of ceremony. The priests offered incense as a softening device. They did not plan to kneel. They planned to tame him. Nahum accepted, because truth is not afraid of being tested by ritual. He climbed the shallow steps and spoke, not with the grand gestures of a showman, but with the careful articulation of a man who knows the weight of language and plans to fulfill it. "The Lord," he said, "is not a tame God. The Lord is a jealous witness to what a people do in secret." A hush fell. Some called him brave, many called him foolish. The king did not appear at that moment, but the palace was listening, and listening becomes a kind of weapon. After Nahum's speech in the temple, after the incense had barely settled, and the priests had exchanged the looks of those used to moving wealth by ease and ritual, Malik moved through the crowd with the slow, deliberate gait of someone who had decided he could not stand mute. He carried with him a single copied list, folded into his cloak. It was not yet the full rule he had seen in the archive, just a fragment rehearsed into his memory, but fragments can ignite when they touch the right place. He made his way toward Nahum, not to confront, not to accuse, but because he had come to feel a kinship with the man who spoke of the foundations. When he reached Nahum, the prophet looked at him with eyes like flint that had been softened by salt. "You carry a ledger of your own," Nahum said quietly, as if he had read Malik's hidden thought. "Do you know how to use it?" Malik felt the heat rise in his cheeks. He had a choice that could not be undone by ink, to hand the copied names to Nahum, to the priests, to the king, to keep them hidden, or to begin the slow work of preserving and telling the story. He did not yet know which of those acts would be the righteous one. He only knew guilt had a gravity, and that silence had made the city easy. "If you are willing," Nahum said, "we will begin where witnesses can speak." It was a gentle summons, and a dangerous one. Malik felt the world tilt from the familiar architecture of his life, the shelves, the official records, the sanctioned lists, into a space where the tape of history might be cut and rewritten. Behind him, the city continued, drums and merchants and the steady tide of a civilization that had grown confident in its own designs. Ahead, a few small rooms held rolls and boxes and the possibility of truth. If there is a single image to hold from those early days, it is this: a young scribe with ink under his fingernails, palms smelling of oil and cedar, stepping across the threshold of complicity into something that demanded courage. The story of a city's fall begins, always, with someone who refuses to let a name be lost. So they began at night to gather. Harith lent his steady hand to the transcription. Naum supplied objects and memories, bringing out ribbons and brittle tokens that matched the marks on the list. Malik carried copies like small flames in a dark room. Nahum prayed softly sometimes, not loud in the way of public performance, but with the private ferocity of a man who knows that when he prays, he carries not only his life, but the life of a city he does not yet know how to save. They did not move quickly. Truth, when it must challenge power, has the patience of a siege, but each day brought small confirmation. A bracelet with a matching notch, a child's name written twice in different hands, a seal shared between a temple official and a palace accountant. The pattern became too coherent to be dismissed as coincidence. Names that had once been speech became entries. Entries became evidence. Evidence would inevitably be either acted upon or buried once more. When Malik finally wrapped one of the copied fragments in oilcloth and strapped it under his cloak, he did not feel victorious. He felt the precise chill of the one who takes responsibility. He knew the city had mechanisms to protect itself. Courts that could be bought, guards who could be bribed, priests who could reframe blame as ritual. He knew the king had a crown heavy enough to bend the truth, yet he also knew a different thing. Names, when spoken, have a stubborn power. They call up those who are owed, and once called, they do not easily return to silence. They would have to decide soon what to do with the rolls, how to present them, and whether to trust a palace that had the habit of smoothing edges rather than tearing seals. And in that decision the city would tremble. The rest of the story waits there, at the edge of disclosure. Paper meets power. What will happen next depends on whether the king opens his heart to the weight of a ledger or uses the ledger to be saved instead of serving justice. If this story stirs something in you, subscribe for more prophetic narratives and reflections, stories that seek to excavate what lies beneath our own foundations. The nights grew colder, or perhaps Malik simply noticed the cold because the burden of names made his hands wakeful. He began to learn the texture of fear, not the heat of immediate danger, but the slow spread of consequences that follow exposure. Harith taught him how to fold, how to compose a list so that it could not be dismissed as slop. Naum taught him how to listen for the pulse of memory in a bracelet's notch. Nahum taught him how to bear the shame of a city without becoming shrill, how to make each word a summons rather than a shout. There were days when Malik felt the city's gaze as a physical thing, a wind that could push a man back into his corner. Soldiers began to watch the places where the small group met. The priests, who had once pretended they had not noticed, began to ask questions about visitors in the temple storerooms. The king, informed by men who feared loss more than justice, murmured about stability. A people need to be whole, some whispered in corridors, and a people cannot be whole if its foundations are dug up for display. But there were also those in the city who were listening differently, widows who half remembered the name of a child, an old craftsman who had found a token under a wall and been told to forget it, a woman who said, "I thought my husband's oath was payment for our survival." These folk came to Naum's door with small things wrapped in cloth because someone had finally named the problem in a public square. When they arrived, Naum did not offer comfort in slogans. She folded their tokens and told them she would keep them like oaths. One afternoon, as the summer shifted imperceptibly toward a heavier air, Malik brought a copied roll to Harith and said, with a voice that trembled but did not break, "We must show this to someone who will open the seals." Harith's eyes bore into him. "Who do you trust to unseal a royal roll? The palace? The priests?" He let the question hang like a sharpened wink. "We have Nahum," Malik said. "If anyone can force the voice of God to be heard here, it is him." The name vibrated in the room. They both heard, in the tremor, the possibilities of salvation and destruction. But choosing Nahum was choosing a path with jagged edges. Prophets can be moved by divine fire, but they also can be made into scapegoats. Nahum's presence in the palace would test the city's capacity for humility. The king, confronted with names under his foundations, would face not merely political risk, but a moral calculus no treasury could settle. As Malik walked back to the archive that evening, he held the copied roll like a small fire. Outside the palace gates, drums beat for a festival he had been assigned to catalogue. The city's surface continued, celebration, feasting, the accustomed rituals of power. Yet beneath those drums, the city was already beginning to quiver, as if the sound of the ledger would someday drown the music. He could not know yet how the balance would tip. At the edge of the quarter, in the quiet of Naum's house, the three of them laid out tokens and rolls. They did not yet plan a public unrolling. They planned first to bind their facts tight, to be sure the ledger they would show could not be reduced to rumor. They matched names to tokens, matched seals to scribal hands, traced the notches where a bracelet's mark corresponded to a signet. The work was slow and meticulous. It was the kind of labor that, when it is done well, makes the truth undeniable. And yet even as they worked, the city moved in its old patterns. Crowds, processions, priests with their hands full of incense and calculation. The king continued to sit at his table, dressed in robes that meant he was above small questions. The drums rolled on. The next morning, as dawn sketched the river with silver, Malik stood at a window and watched the city stretch itself awake. He thought of the men whose names had been written and then buried in stone. He thought of the women who had been told their vows meant a child's protection, and then had been left with nothing but a hole in the wall. He felt the pull of the ledger as a knot in his chest that would not untie itself. Somewhere in that knot lay the future of a city, and his. He carried the copied roll like a secret flame, and for a moment let the city wake without him. The river gleamed, barges slid like slow thoughts along its current. Children chased one another across bridges that had been mended 1,000 times, and men in fine cloaks crossed thresholds as though their footprints would never be questioned. Malik held the oilcloth close and thought of the names he had read, names that had been given to stones as if stones could answer pleas. His throat tightened with a weight he could no longer ignore. They agreed, in a council of 3 by lamplight, that the only place large enough to host the truth was the place where power most feared shame. The palace. If the king would receive the rolls and listen, perhaps the city could be made to answer for what it had done. If the king turned away, then paper would be burned and names would be lost again. There was no comfortable middle. "Power will want to preserve itself," Harith said softly, smoothing the edge of a document with hands that had steadied rebellions in ink alone. "But kings have fear too. Pride often hides a thinner thing, a fear of being forgotten rightly. We must be precise. We must be ready for subterfuge." Naum, who kept small memories as if tending a fragile fire, wrapped a bracelet in linen and set it among the rolls. "Bring not only words," she said, "bring things that prove the words. A token is a witness that men cannot call merely a rumor." Nahum listened to the plan without surprise, like a man who had been counting the steps of a long road. He had never chosen the easy path, he had chosen the faithful one. "We will go to the palace," he said. "The voice I carry does not ask permission to speak. It asks only that truth be given a chance to meet power." So they moved with the care of those who know the difference between boldness and recklessness. Malik, with a small satchel under his cloak, walked the route that took him past the outer market and into the compound where the king's gate listened for rumor. Soldiers eyed him, more out of habit than suspicion, until he crossed into the inner court and felt the air change. The palace held itself like a thing designed to be unassailable. High walls, watchers, a throne that seemed to absorb heat from the room. The guards processed their duty with the boredom of the accustomed. Word of their intent could have been enough to stop them. It was not. The king, at first, received the delegation as a curiosity. He would receive many delegations a day. It was his trade to hear and then file. He did not expect the life of his city to be summoned from the folds of paper. A king's attention is a rare currency. They knew they would not squander it. When Malik presented the folded copy, a guard took it with the casual efficiency of one who has handled many petitions. The guard unrolled enough to nod, and then gave the parcel to a scribe near the throne. Paper passed through hands that had been taught to sort truth from nuisance. Nahum stood quietly, his robe a simple thing against embroidered banners, and watched as the king's court considered whether to be amused or alarmed. The court's reaction was an anatomy of power. First disbelief, then annoyance, then the slow calculation that leads men to decide whether they can afford to be just. The chief priest, accustomed to guiding consciences in the service of the temple's stability, frowned as if he tasted acid. The king, who had built projects to rival the mouths that sang his praises, leaned forward. There is a posture a ruler takes when a ledger is put before him. It is the posture of weighing treasures against consequence. They asked to hear more. They asked to see the original. They sent a runner to the archive, and the runner, with the speed of someone who smelled opportunity, returned with a sealed roll the next day. Seals were broken in cautious rooms, guards closed doors, and the palace drew a breath like a body preparing for a verdict. The protective ritual of the palace was slow, ceremonial, designed to blunt the shock of whatever might follow. They unrolled the parchment in a chamber ringed by men who had everything to lose or gain from the outcome. Malik and Harith stood at one side. Noema, who would not be kept away, stood at the other with the bracelet in the palm of her hand. In the center, the king sat beneath his canopy, his crown catching the light like a small sun refusing to be put out. Nahum stood nearest to the door, as a man who knows how to keep his words ready. The first names were read aloud in a voice that trembled only once. Sound carries differently in rooms of judgment. It becomes an instrument. When a scribe gave voice to a child's name, beside a signature that matched the palace's stamp, a hush fell, as if the paper had lodged in the throat of the assembly. The priest pressed his lip. The captain flushed. The merchant who had provided rope to the crown shifted his weight. "What is this?" the king asked finally, but the question was both legal and moral. He could have questioned the authenticity, the motive, the provenance. He could have dismissed it as forgery. Instead, he did a rarer thing. He listened to the pattern. He examined the seals and saw the overlap, palatial signs entwined with temple marks. The ledger was not a simple accounting of gifts. It bore the signature of a system. "These names," Harith said, "are not merely lists. They are records of vows, and of what was paid when vows were made. They are a ledger of bargains that altered the lives of the powerless." "Who authorized this?" demanded a court official, whose loyalty to the system was measurable in the way he kept his eyes steady. "Who ordered children to be preserved in the foundations?" Noema interrupted, voice steady like a hand on a wound. "They were given as tokens. They were promised as offerings, and their names were written as proof." The king's fingers scratched the arm of his chair like a man feeling the texture of a coin. Rulers are taught to think of consequences in units of stability. To sanction shame risks loss. To correct shame risks exposure. Of allies, of their own lapses. A moment opened. He could take the roll and bury it. He could ordain a quiet resolution and keep his city's image unmarred. Or he could place the roll before the people and test whether justice, when required of the powerful, still served those who had no title. Nahum stepped forward with a voice that required no crown's permission. "The Lord calls for account," he said. "When the city sanctifies greed with ritual, it becomes an altar of forgetting. Break not only seals, but the habit of denial. Let the names be spoken where they can be matched to objects and to witnesses. Let the city answer for what it has offered as safety at the price of the least among you." There is a moment when words cross from being informative to becoming a mirror. The king saw in Nahum's eyes an insistence that could not be negotiated away with gifts. Pride shivered. He felt, perhaps for the first time in a long rule, a vulnerability that had nothing to do with enemies at the gate. To admit error would be to open a gate to shame that might topple a reign constructed on careful arrangements. Yet to deny the ledger would be to muffle a voice that would not remain quiet. Underneath the pomp, there was another calculation. A small group of the king's advisers urged caution. "We can examine," they said. "Privately, we can verify and then manage the matter." The priests were not unanimous. Some argued for a secret tribunal. Others, whose consciences were restless, urged transparency. In the end, the king made a public choice, hesitant, partial, and revealing. He decreed that the roll would be read aloud in the city square at the close of market day. A public reading would signal a willingness to listen. It would also defang the matter by turning it into spectacle. The court hailed the decision as wise, open enough for the crown to appear magnanimous, closed enough to hold the narrative within controlled frames. Nahum accepted with the patience of someone who knew how to make judgment land where it would not be swallowed. Malik felt the ground move under his feet, not with earth's tremor, but with the shift that comes when a plan leaves the margins and meets daylight. The people who had been keeping tokens came out, small and unsure, and Noema placed the bracelet on a cloth, like an offering she could not designate as belonging to any one god, only to memory. The square filled. The voices there carried a mix of curiosity and dread. Merchants sold bread and watched with practiced indifference. Children chased each other through the crowd. But the air tasted different, like the change that comes to a room when a lamp is lit. When the scribe read the second name and the seal, a ripple moved through the assembly. People began to murmur the way those who have new knowledge test its edges by whisper. A priest rose to defend the city's reputation. He argued that vows, once offered, were matters between God and worshipper. He cautioned the people against dragging the temple's rites into politics. "The ways of the gods are not for the marketplace to judge," he intoned, voice polished by ritual. Then Noema stepped forward and spoke with the clarity of one who has held many small broken things. She showed bracelets, tokens, a child's chipped toy. She told stories in brief strokes. Mothers who believed a charm could buy their child's safety. A man who placed his son's name on a slate and then watched the city take that slate as if it were a receipt. The crowd listened, and what happens in a public square is never just what the speakers say. It is what the people begin to do with the information they receive. At the end of the day, something fragile shifted. A few voices called for inquiry, for a proper accounting. Others said the matter could be the work of a few scribes gone rogue, not systemic. The king, who had opened the public reading, now stood before an assembly that expected him to act. His heart, if kings possess such things, felt the weight of names beyond his ledger. It was at this point that a resistance assembled. Men in the king's inner circle, worried about precedent and profit, plotted to protect the status quo. They whispered in halls, slipped messages to guards, and sought to present Nahum as a troublemaker. The machinery of denial began to turn, accusations of slander, questions about Nahum's origins, suggestions that the rolls might be forgeries. The old habits of silencing what unsettles power made their moves like a practiced dance. The pressure was not only institutional. Threats appeared in the margins, veiled warnings to Naum, intimations that Harith's pension might be at risk, a soldier who lingered too long near Malik's workplace. They wanted fear to do the work of evidence. Fear can be as persuasive as a seal. Nahum, confronted now not only by the city's structures but by the subterranean will to protect itself, did not retreat. He stood beneath the banners and spoke in a voice that was at once severe and compassionate. "God does not require cruelty as proof," he said. "Repentance is not a performance, it is a turning. If a king will turn, there is mercy. If a city will change its heart, there is restoration." The possible turning hovered like a hinge ready to swing. The king, for a breath, seemed moved. He sat with his hands folded, and some said they saw in his face the shadow of an old man who had once held a child's hand and known human frailty. To act and to be just would cost him alliances. To do nothing would cost him the soul of his name. He reached for the ledger again, and this time he did something no court had expected. He ordered an investigation to be public and thorough. Whether it was courage, expedience, or genuine conscience, the decree was made. The city would watch. But the moment of potential mercy is not the end of pressure. It is the beginning of escalation. As the investigation began, signs came that the narrative had a gravity the city could not contain. They were not invented signs. They were disruptions that a people who had made themselves safe had not learned to interpret. First, the locusts. They were not merely pests, but a pattern, swarms that appeared on fields the city relied upon, arriving in a season when harvest should have been plenty. They stripped the outer crops in a single night, leaving a wasted margin that could be read as more than mere natural occurrence. Farmers wept quietly as they counted losses of a season that promised bread. Some said the locusts were consequence. Others denied a cause beyond weather. Still, fear grew in the marketplaces where the price of grain began to rise. Then a wind came, a heat-laden gust that moved with a smell of singed wood and of distant fire. It seemed to wrap palaces in a brief haze that made lamplight tremble and candles sputter. The priests muttered prayers as if to find an explanation before shame found them instead. The people, already unsettled, began to speak of portents. Proverbs that had lain dormant saw the light. A people who forget their foundations will have those foundations judged. As signs multiplied, the river, ever a witness to Nineveh's commerce, began to behave oddly. A sudden surge, not expected for the season, sent currents higher and dragged along debris from upriver. It carved at the banks beneath structures that had been assumed unassailable. Where foundations had been patched with haste and sealed with convenient bargains, the water found purchase. A wall here shifted, a stair collapsed there. Architects swore that poor workmanship always reveals itself in pressure. A priest would say the heavens voice displeasure. The city's confidence, which had been built on both wealth and denial, discovered that it could not simply be reasserted by proclamation. All the while, the court continued its hearings. Witnesses spoke. A mother who had placed a charm in a foundation, bartered in desperation. A laborer who had been paid to lay stone and had seen a token dropped into mortar. A former palace attendant who told, with a shaking voice, of ledgers that recorded names as if they were inventory. Each testimony was a nail in the structure that defended silence. At first, the king listened with an openness that surprised his advisers. He walked among those who had come forward. He asked questions, not like a monarch reading a report, but like a man trying to understand how his reach had failed him. There was a brief window, thin but luminous, when he could have moved the city toward restoration, to remove corrupt officials, to reassign temple holdings, to erect a public memorial for those whose names had been hidden. The possibility shimmered as a path both costly and brave, But power is a compound of many desires. The merchants whispered of losses. The temple elders feared diminished offerings. Allies of the crown privately warned that uprooting entrenched practices might invite chaos. And so, pressured from the inside, the king hesitated. He ordered reforms, half measures clothed in good wording, commissions to study the issue, promises to review temple charges, vows to consider new laws. Words fell like petals that do not quite reach the ground. Nahum, watching the dance between conscience and convenience, did not dramatize. He pressed gently but relentlessly for names to be honored and for restitution where possible. "Justice is not a show," he said. "If this is to be remedied, do not seek to hush the wound with fine cloth. Let us name those who were offered as a price, and let us mend what can be mended." For a time it seemed the city might lean toward repair. Malik believed that the ledger's weight would press the king into bold acts of correction. Harith worked late into nights composing public records that would not be easy to tamper with. Noma, worn and hopeful, collected tokens that would be publicly displayed, small proofs that made denial harder. The people who had lent their voices were ready to risk the consequence of telling the truth. Then the ground shifted again, this time with a force that would not be ignored. A sudden flood moved from upriver, driven by storms in lands the city had rarely tended to. Waters rose with a speed that surprised engineers. Barricades failed. Lower and older parts of Nineveh, where foundations had taken the place of graves and bargains had been made beneath stones, were the first to feel the change. Houses were swamped, storerooms flooded, and where children's toys had once been placed as votive signs, now mud held shapes that could not be recaptured. The city panicked. Soldiers that had been numbers on a roster became hands trying to drag people out from where memory had been hidden under mortar and brick. Bells rang in temples that had been hesitant to repent, now tolling for immediate rescue. The king, whose hesitation had been public, found himself conducting relief with a voice that did not squarely meet the ledger's demand. He walked along streets that had begun to break and encountered faces that questioned whether his limited measures were sufficient. In the midst of commotion, Nahum stood and spoke with a voice that found a still center. "A people cannot receive what they do not make room for," he said. "If your city sheltered violence with vows, then shelter will undo itself. But it is not the Lord's wish that you fall and remain in ruin. Turn, and mercy will be given. Repair these things with justice, restore names, build laws that remember rather than bury." Will the king turn fully was the question that throbbed through the crowd like a pulse. He called a council in the palace that day, with priests and merchants, with Harith and Malik in attendance. There was a moment when he could have declared the removal of those tied to the corruption, a full confession accompanied by plans for restitution. But ties are many and tangled. A ruler in the throes of such a decision had to weigh the wrath of allies as a cost of righteousness. He hesitated again and chose instead a ritual of partial change. Some officials would be dismissed, some offerings redirected, but crucial patterns of patronage would remain untouched. That fulcrum, partial change, was the hinge upon which the city's fate tilted. For a people who had built their security on bargains and sealed names under foundations, half measures were not sufficient. The water that had already found cracks widened them. The locusts returned, with more appetite, and fires, small at first, broke in warehouses where flammable goods were stored for the wealthy. The city's defenses, praised in times of dry peace, proved brittle under the sudden weight of compounding calamity. As the calamities came in sequence, first locusts, then winds and fires, then flood swells, the mood moved from fear to a kind of stunned comprehension. People began to say aloud what they had only hinted at before. "Our pride made us blind," an old craftsman murmured. "We made bargains to build faster, richer, and we buried the cost." In the market square, that confession spread until it took the form of public lament. Voices prayed and repented in a way they had not when Nahum first spoke. Some truly turned, those whose consciences had been seat of restlessness all along. They sought restitution, asked to be cleansed, offered to help rebuild on terms of justice. Others, whose benefit lay in concealment, only did the minimal, announcing charitable acts they had calculated would appease the angry gods and quiet the rumor mills. Then the city's very walls, symbols of permanence, showed their vulnerability. A portion of the outer wall, already undermined by continuous water pressure, began to sink. In one terrifying day, a great section gave way, as if the accumulated weight of all the city's decisions had finally found its outlet. Stone cascaded, not with the gruesome detail of battle, but with the inevitability of a structure failing under its own contradictions. People fled. The king, who had been weighed down by choices, saw his palace within earshot of crumbling defenses. His advisers shouted for order. Soldiers formed lines. The city, trained for pageantry, had little practice for honest rescue. Executive measures were taken, ramps and ropes, routes for the afflicted, emergency councils. Yet in the midst of rescue, the ledger's victims, those whose names had been buried or whose tokens were hidden, surfaced in one human way after another. A woman found a bracelet lodged in debris where a new wall had been raised. She held it up, and the crowd recognized the mark Naum had described. A man found a slate with a child's name half covered by mortar. Small proofs became public accusations. The words of the priests who had once spoken of ritual were tossed against the fact of what had been done. In the chaos of the fall, the king made a final decision that would define his reign. He ordered that the rolls be formally unsealed and copied into public registers. He declared that those whose names had been found would be honored in a manner befitting the city's promise. In the rawness of those hours, clarity arrived. He had chosen at last to be judged by the common measure of justice rather than by the preservation of his image. That choice did not avert the city's collapse. Walls cannot be rebuilt in an instant, nor trust reassembled from debris. But it changed the character of what followed. Where once the city's fall might have been a tale of mere ruin, it now contained within it acts of confession and the first gestures of restitution. The king, whose voice had once hesitated, stood in public and acknowledged the ledger. He vowed to establish new statutes. Gifts could no longer be recorded in ways that obscured human lives. Tokens placed in foundations would henceforth be accounted for as inalienable memory, not as bargains to be sealed away. Nahum, in the days that followed, walked among the fallen. He spoke not with triumph, but with a steady compassion that made room for both grief and possible renewal. Justice will not undo what was done, he told the crowds, but it can shape what remains. The Lord calls us to repair and to remember. Where we rebuild, let us build on mercy as well as on stone. The aftermath was a season of labor. Malik, Harith, and Noema became part of a small cadre tasked with preserving names. They wrote copies that would survive fire and flood. They placed memory stones at river crossings and in courtyards where children could still play. They taught a new practice. Before new foundations are set, names are spoken aloud and a public record created. The city that once had buried its victims under mortar now carried them in its open places. Some were reburied with ceremonies that restored dignity. Others were honored with daily mentions at noon in the market square. Small rituals multiplied into public customs. Memory changed the way people spoke. Where once vows had been private bargains, they became communal obligations. The temple's role shifted as well. Some priests, repentant, learned to see their altars as places of accountability rather than instruments of convenience. Merchants who had once profited from folded transactions found it harder to cloak their ledgers. The king, having tasted the cost of half measures, began to push legal reforms that made concealment more difficult and restitution clearer. None of these changes removed the pain of loss, but they formed a new covenant of sorts, an insistence that the city's foundations would hold both stone and truth. Malik himself changed most of all. He had started as a recorder, a watchful hand in the margins. After the fall, he became a keeper of lists that were not merely administrative, but moral. He copied names onto tablets designed to withstand both weather and forgetfulness. He taught young scribes not to smooth over inscriptions, but to preserve awkward details. No longer did he feel that his ink was merely a tool, it was a responsibility. He found, in the act of recording, a strange consolation. Names, once read, no longer belonged solely to the powerful who buried them. They became part of the city's shared life. Harith, older and slower, walked through the newly quiet streets with an expression of hard-earned peace. He had seen empires rise and fall, and had learned that the only lasting work is the one that keeps memory. He would sit at the market steps and tell children stories of tokens and rolls, not to frighten them, but to teach them the cost of living where truth is ignored. Noema, whose hands had kept small things, now oversaw a small repository where artifacts and names were stored together, a place that was part memorial and part school. People came to leave objects there and to hear their story told aloud. The city, wounded anew, changed its rituals. Where once wealth and status determined who was heard, now a public register invited the voices of the small and the quiet. It was not perfect. The old habits kept poking through like roots under pavement. Power does not vanish overnight. But for those who had lived through the tremors, the promise of a city that would remember its weak was a light to guide future work. And the theological arc of the story required a facing of deeper questions. Nahum's prophecy had not been a cry for vengeance. It had been a summons to repentance and an exposure of the way private sin accretes into public destruction. In his final messages, he spoke of the mercy that remained open to those who would turn. "The Lord's hand is heavy with justice," he said, "and yet the Lord's door stands for those who return. Even in the wake of collapse, there is a path to restoration, if we receive it with humility." This balance between justice and mercy became the city's teaching for generations. They learned that true restoration requires accountability. Names must be preserved, wrongs addressed, tokens honored, and they learned that mercy does not negate justice, it accompanies it. In the courtrooms and marketplaces that followed, the law began to reflect a people shaped not by the desire to protect the powerful, but to preserve the weak. For Malik, the work of preserving names was not merely bureaucratic. It held a spiritual character. He would sit by the river at dusk and read the names aloud, voice carrying across the water, believing that speech itself can reweave the torn. At times he would feel Nahum's presence in the rhythm of the reading, the cadence of a prophet who had brought a weighty thing into open air. The sound of names was not only moral, it was sacramental. To speak into being those the city had tried to lose was, in that community, to restore a small piece of God's order. The city's memory, newly public, shaped future architecture as well as law. Builders were required to make room for memory stones, and public ceremonies were instituted where names of the vulnerable were commemorated each year. Noema's repository became a pilgrimage point for those who wished to learn how small tokens can carry witness through time. Harith's copies were kept as exemplars of fidelity in recording, examples to teach young scribes that accuracy is an ethical practice. Nahum, after the fall and after much of the speaking, withdrew from public life. He returned to simpler places to pray, to speak counsel to those who sought it, and to write what did not appear in official records. He did not rejoice at the fall. He mourned. He also recognized the stirring of something like newness in the city's unwilling posture to repeat itself. "We are not saved by destruction," he would say. We are saved by turning away from the ways that led us to destruction. The last scenes of this city's drama were not of unadulterated joy. There were widows who could not be replaced, children whose names would remain marks on stone, people who refused to change and left to find safety elsewhere. Yet there were also acts of courageous repair. A captain who gave up a post to care for the displaced, a priest who relinquished a portion of the temple's wealth to fund restitution, a small school established where children learned to read names as gifts rather than as burdens. If there is a lesson that goes beyond the particulars of a city, it is this: foundations matter. Not just the physical mortar beneath our feet, but the moral underpinnings of our societies, the promises we keep, the bargains we refuse to make at the cost of others' lives, the loyalty we have to truth. When a community hides what is wrong, it does not only silence a few, it sets up a mechanism that will eventually demand account. Listen then, in the hush that follows, to the questions Nahum pressed into the city and into hearts. What are you willing to hide to keep comfort? Whose names have you turned into margins? When confronted with a ledger that exposes your compromises, will you choose the difficult path of repair or the safer route of concealment? This story is not meant to inspire triumph. It is intended as a summons. There is grace for those who repent. There is obligation for those who confess. The Lord, as Nahum insisted, is not merely a deity of destruction, but of restoration, a God who calls the powerful to account and opens a way for the humble to rebuild. As the years that followed became the city's new history, memory stones were set along the river where the tide could touch them. People would come to read names aloud as part of a ritual that reminded them daily of the cost of silence. Children grew up knowing that the city had once been proud and had been taught by calamity to do better. And in quiet moments, when Malik walked among those stones, with the slow attention of a man who had learned the holiness of keeping a list, he would place his hand upon a name and feel the long thread that connects a single life to the whole. If this tale has a central image, it is not the toppling wall, but the slow human labor that followed. Hands that recorded names again and again, small tokens that found their place on altars of memory. A king who belatedly chose to bind his reign to justice rather than to image. The collapse could not be undone, the names could not be restored to life, but the community that survived learned to honor the living by remembering the dead properly, an act of mercy and of truth. So what of us, listening beyond the river and the ruins? What foundations are we laying, those of compassion or of convenience? Every society builds on choices. Which voices we amplify, which bargains we accept in private, what counts as progress when measured against human dignity. The story of Nineveh, as Nahum told it, and as the city lived it, is a mirror. It asks us to consider the small acts that accrete into public consequence. It invites us to preserve names, to insist on justice, and to refuse bargains that buy silence. There is room for hope. Mercy stands ready for those who turn. If a king could be persuaded, however late, to make restitution and to change law, then we too can seek the hard work of repair where we find concealment. But such repair costs us something: a willingness to be honest, the courage to listen to names, the endurance to change systems rather than merely to dress them with new words. To care for those on the margins, to keep the names of the vulnerable visible, is not merely a humanitarian act, it is an act of covenant fidelity. Remember the image with which we began, a wall that looked eternal but became sand when undercut by truth. Remember the mother who left a token at Noema's door, believing a charm would save her child. The scribe who turned his ink into a weapon of conscience, the prophet who spoke for the silent. Remember that the darkest secrets do not always dwell in monstrous acts, but in the smaller betrayals that become normalized, the bargains, the sealed rolls, the tokens made into tools of forgetfulness. If you carry a list, literal or metaphorical, do not let it become a ledger of forgetting. Speak the names you know. Ask who benefits from silence in your community. Preserve memory. Hold leaders to account. Build on the foundation of justice rather than on the convenience of cover-ups. The mercy that awaits those who turn is real, but it requires action. If this story moved you, share it and consider what foundation you are building on.